Welcome back, and in today's episode, I'm looking at United States' most horrific animal attacks ever recorded. From a widow who stepped into shallow Florida water to retrieve a dog's toy and vanished beneath the surface, to a woman whose trip to a Washington marina ended after one slip into the middle of a sea lion colony. It was August 9, 2018. A traveling circus had stopped outside a small county fairground somewhere in the Southwest during the middle of a summer tour. By early morning, most of the public areas were still empty, while workers behind the tents cleaned cages and prepared equipment before the afternoon performances. The heat was already climbing past 85 degrees not long after sunrise. Dustin Sorrell was 29 years old and one of the younger animal handlers on the crew. He had only worked directly around big cats for a few years, but he quickly became known for volunteering for the most hands-on enclosure work whenever he had the chance. Dustin genuinely enjoyed being close to the animals and acted more relaxed around the cages than some of the older handlers liked. The fast pace and unpredictability of the work were part of what kept him interested. Around the animals, Dustin carried himself more like someone chasing excitement than someone doing dangerous work. If Scott trusted routine and Alan tried controlling every situation, Dustin was almost the opposite. He seemed to enjoy the unpredictability around the cages more than anything else about circus life. And compared to the earlier animals in these stories, jaguars behave very differently at close range. They rely heavily on speed, reflexes, and precise bursts of movement rather than intimidation displays or prolonged aggression. Adult jaguars are compact but heavily muscled animals with one of the strongest bite forces among big cats, especially for their size. Inside tight enclosures, they can change direction and react almost instantly with very little space to move. That morning started as a routine cleanup behind the animal trailers. The Jaguar had already been shifted into a narrow side compartment while Dustin cleaned the larger holding section nearby. The enclosure used a sliding divider system designed to separate the animal safely during feeding and maintenance work. Around him, the morning cleanup behind the cages was already fully underway, with hoses running, generators humming, and workers moving supplies between trailers. Nothing about the enclosure area felt especially tense or unusual that morning. Water spread slowly across the concrete floor while Dustin rinsed debris toward the drainage corner near the divider gate. He moved casually through the enclosure, spraying down the walls and occasionally kicking standing water toward the drain, while the Jaguar stayed low behind the divider bars, watching him move around the cage. At one point, Dustin crouched near the divider track to pull debris away from the drainage corner beside the gate. As he shifted the bucket across the floor, the plastic container suddenly scraped loudly against the metal divider and tipped sideways near the partially latched opening. The Jaguar moved immediately. People working nearby barely had time to react before the animal lunged through the gap near the divider gate. The entire attack unfolded within only a few seconds. The Jaguar clamped onto Dustin near the upper shoulder and neck area while he tried pushing himself backward across the wet concrete. The struggle stayed concentrated near the divider opening until nearby handlers forced the sliding barrier shut again using the external control handle. By the time the divider locked back into place, Dustin was lying motionless beside the drainage corner. Workers pulled him out of the enclosure and moved him beside the trailer lane, while emergency help was requested from the fairground office nearby. The entire incident happened so quickly that some workers nearby did not fully understand what happened until Dustin had already been pulled out of the enclosure. Dustin died at the scene from severe blood loss caused by injuries to the neck and upper chest. Later that morning, the overturned bucket still remained near the divider track where Dustin had slipped earlier during the cleanup. The final findings listed the partially secured divider gate and wet flooring conditions as contributing factors. Investigators later reviewed the enclosure setup and confirmed the divider gate had not been fully secured before cleanup began. The death was ruled an accidental handling incident. I think what makes Dustin's case stand out is how casual everything felt right before the attack. The crew was already busy with normal morning work, and Dustin himself probably thought he was just finishing another routine cleanup job. It was September 11th, 2017, at a regional zoological park in the southwestern United States during a supervised morning program in an open free-contact elephant training yard. Kalen Verreau was 19, there as a volunteer in a wildlife outreach program. He was still new to all of it, so he didn't really handle the elephants directly on his own. Mostly he observed, and only stepped in for short, supervised moments with a young elephant while staff guided everything. The facility had a small group of Asian elephants, including a calf, and an adult female. Things there were very structured. It all came down to positioning and cues. Staff guiding the elephants into specific spots using trained signals and targets, keeping everything in place through constant supervision rather than physical separation. So yeah, it was basically this setup where everyone, humans and elephants, was moving within these defined zones, and the staff were always watching and directing how everything lined up and stayed separated, at least from what I could see at the time. During the session, the calf was brought into the central training area for routine conditioning, while the adult female remained in a separate section of the same open enclosure with visual and auditory access. The system relied on trained behavior, stationing cues, and continuous keeper oversight to maintain spacing within a shared open enclosure without physical barriers. Kaylin was allowed brief, supervised direct interaction with the calf during a structured handling sequence under keeper instruction, while staff divided their attention between monitoring volunteer positioning and maintaining the elephant's stationing behavior across the broader shared yard. The adult female elephant became increasingly attentive to the interaction involving the calf. As calf vocalization and close human presence continued, her posture and movement shifted toward a protective response pattern consistent with maternal vigilance. As Kaylin maintained controlled proximity to the calf under instruction, the adult elephant left her assigned station following a breakdown in stationing compliance and moved toward the handling area within the shared yard. Loss of target focus occurred during simultaneous calf handling, reducing the adult elephant's responsiveness to stationing cues. Her movement was directed toward the calf and surrounding activity rather than exploratory behavior. Within the designated working area of the yard, the escalation occurred quickly. Staff issued repeated verbal halt commands and attempted to re-establish spatial control using target cues and repositioning signals, but the elephant did not return to her assigned stationing point. I think commands don't really land the way people think they do. It's not even about being ignored. It's more like there's no space left for them to matter. Kaylin began to withdraw as instructed, but the available open space and the speed of the animal's approach reduced the distance available for separation. As he moved backward, the adult elephant closed in, compressing the remaining space before safe repositioning could be achieved. Close-range contact occurred, leaving insufficient time for further intervention. Emergency response was initiated immediately. Kaylin sustained severe blunt force and compressive trauma, lost consciousness rapidly, and was pronounced dead after emergency services arrived. The impact resulted in catastrophic compressive trauma to the thoracic region, including rib fractures and severe internal organ injury consistent with high-force blunt impact. An investigation identified a breakdown in spatial supervision and stationing compliance during a multi-animal handling session, including insufficient control of the adult elephant's positioning during calf-focused interaction. No structural or mechanical failures were found. Protocols were later revised to strengthen separation of calf interaction sessions from adult elephant proximity and improve redundancy in stationing control during volunteer-involved handling work. It was July 4th, 2018, and the small zoo on the outskirts of a Venezuelan city was closed for its afternoon staff break. That was the day Kendra Lomax, known online as Kiki, used an unlocked gate and walked straight in. Kiki was 23, from Ohio, and had built a following across Instagram and musical.ly by sneaking into animal facilities and filming what she called the truth about captivity. She had no formal background in wildlife or animal behavior. What she had was a firm belief that captive, large reptiles were psychologically broken, adjusted to human presence, and no longer capable of real aggression. She had volunteered at small sanctuaries, handled juvenile reptiles, and spent years around captive facilities. She had just decided that what she had seen was representative of all of it. That is the part that is difficult to move past. It was not ignorance, it was a certainty, and certainty in the wrong direction is far more dangerous than not knowing anything at all. Kiki had arrived in Venezuela 3 days earlier, posing as a wildlife photography student. The zoo was severely underfunded, its staff reduced to a skeleton crew, its single overnight guard working for a salary that Venezuelan hyperinflation had made nearly worthless. She offered him $60. In mid-2018, that sum was equivalent to several months of effective income. The gate was left unlocked. Think about what that exchange actually was. She paid $60 for access to a critically endangered crocodile in an unsupervised enclosure with no safety equipment and no backup. That was the budget for this plan. $60. The enclosure held a male Orinoco crocodile the staff called Cesar. During the midday closure, Kiki climbed the outer fence, crossed the viewing barrier, and lowered herself into the shallow edge of the enclosure pond, carrying a raw chicken piece she had brought. She was recording audio on her phone. Cesar was visible at the surface, eyes up, almost motionless. Here is what gets missed every time someone describes a captive crocodile as docile. Motionless is not passive. A crocodilian holding position at the surface with its eyes up is doing exactly what it is built to do. That stillness is not disengagement. It is the default posture of an ambush predator. Cesar had lived at the zoo for years and was used to seeing people near the water. He no longer backed away when humans came close. But being used to people did not make him tame or safe. The workers often fed him near the edge of the pond, so movement near the water could make him think food was coming. The Orinoco crocodile is critically endangered, with fewer than 1,500 individuals left in the wild. Adult males exceed 13 feet and can weigh over 600 pounds. They are ambush predators that strike from still positions at the waterline with explosive forward momentum and almost no warning movement. She waded to within a few feet and extended the chicken toward the water. Cesar did not retreat. He launched forward and clamped down on her left thigh and lower abdomen in a single motion. She was in roughly 28 inches of water and could not pull free. The bite caused catastrophic crushing trauma to the upper thigh and pelvic region, with severe arterial bleeding that could not be controlled without immediate surgical intervention. The guard later said he heard shouting from somewhere near the reptile section. When he reached there, he found her face down near the edge of the pond, still barely breathing. He pulled her clear using a hooked pole from outside the enclosure barrier, but could not stop the bleeding. She died at the scene at 2:28 p.m. The nearest ambulance was 45 minutes away. Her phone had been recording a voice memo throughout. Venezuelan authorities collected it during the initial scene review. The investigation was closed without charges, citing insufficient resources for a formal proceeding. The recording was never made public. Cesar was transferred to a closed-access conservation facility in the months that followed. What kept me wondering is how many enclosures she had entered before this one. Every exit she made from those places told her the same thing, that she had it figured out. Cesar was just the first animal that disagreed. It was March 21st, 2018, off the coast of Gansbai. A vessel departed Kleinbai Harbor early that morning for a scheduled great white shark cage diving excursion. Conditions were calm and visibility was good. Todd Hargrove was 51 years old and worked in logistics management outside Denver, Colorado. He had booked the trip after his mother Dolores mentioned during Christmas dinner that she wanted to do something memorable before turning 75. Todd turned that comment into a full adventure vacation within weeks, despite nobody else in the family expressing interest in sharks. Co-workers and relatives described him as someone who assumed that paying for an experience gave him standing to question how it was run. The marine biologist running operations that morning covered the primary rule of the excursion during the safety briefing. No part of the body was to extend outside the cage at any time. Todd asked whether fingers holding a camera counted. Werner confirmed they did. I want to point something out here. He asked that question during the safety briefing and got a direct answer. The first rotation passed without incident. Todd entered the water during the second alongside his son, Bryce, and two other divers. Almost immediately, he started complaining about visibility. The viewing gaps between the cage bars were intentionally narrow. On the port side, however, one repaired section had slightly wider vertical spacing than the rest after part of a weld seam had been replaced the previous season. Todd noticed it within minutes and repeatedly forced himself against that section to improve his view toward the bait line above. Bryce grabbed the back of his wetsuit twice, trying to pull him away because he was shaking the entire cage. The marine biologist later identified the approaching shark as a male measuring roughly 15 feet that had been observed regularly in the area. Todd had managed to wedge part of his right shoulder and the side of his head beyond the plane of the bars, seconds before the animal arrived. Sudden movement close to an active bait line can trigger rapid investigatory lunges from great whites, especially in heavily stimulated feeding conditions. The shark surged upward toward the disturbance near the bait line and clamped onto the exposed area before immediately thrashing away from the cage. The impact slammed the entire structure sideways without warning. Bryce wasn't braced for it. His head whipped directly into one of the lower steel bars, hard enough to shatter his dive mask against the frame underwater. One of the other divers later said the sound carried through the cage even beneath the surface. Bryce immediately went limp for a moment after the collision before instinctively grabbing the side rail. Blood spread through the water around his face as the cage continued rocking beneath the surface. Crew members above heard shouting underwater and began raising the platform while Werner ordered the bait line cut immediately. Todd collapsed backward into the cage, bleeding heavily and showing no purposeful movement after the strike. Bryce surfaced dazed and disoriented, struggling to stay upright, while another diver held onto his harness during the lift. By the time the platform cleared the surface, blood was pouring from deep cuts around Bryce's nose and right eye caused by the shattered mask and impact against the steel frame. The collision had also fractured part of his orbital socket and cheekbone. Several passengers initially believed he had been bitten too. Todd Hargrove was pronounced dead before the vessel reached shore. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as catastrophic traumatic injuries to the head and upper body, consistent with a large shark bite at close range. Bryce survived after emergency surgery in Cape Town and later required reconstructive procedures to repair fractures around his eye. He also suffered a severe concussion from the underwater impact. Investigators concluded the equipment had functioned properly and that the fatality resulted primarily from repeated violation of safety instructions. The widened repair section was flagged as a contributing factor during the review. It was the afternoon of August 7, 2017, along a remote riverbank inside Katmai National Park, Alaska. The group had been camping in the backcountry for 3 days when they encountered the bear near the water's edge. Stefano Marchetti was 34 years old and worked as an assistant manager for a regional outdoor equipment store in Boise, Idaho. He had grown up camping regularly with his father throughout the Pacific Northwest and considered himself more experienced outdoors than most tourists. He had never encountered a wild grizzly at close range before, but he frequently told friends that large predators generally avoided humans unless people panicked first. In the months before the trip, he had been dealing with mounting financial stress after a breakup and accumulating debt from a failed online business. People who knew him said he had become increasingly defensive whenever others questioned his judgment. The Alaska trip had been planned as a way to clear his head. Throughout the week, he had dismissed bear safety instructions from park staff as rules designed for inexperienced tourists and became visibly annoyed whenever the group stopped to discuss procedures. I've covered enough of these cases to recognize this pattern, and it never gets easier to watch. There's only so many times you can say something to someone who has already decided you don't understand the situation as well as they do. By the time they spotted the bear near the riverbank, witnesses said Stefano already seemed irritated by how cautiously the group was reacting. The grizzly was feeding along the water's edge approximately 90 feet from the group. Park guidelines required hikers to maintain a minimum distance of 300 feet from bears, and to move away slowly if an animal was spotted at close range. Stefano stopped and watched it instead. He told the group the bear had not noticed them and that backing away would only draw attention. One friend quietly suggested they move. Stefano dismissed it. He took several steps closer to get a better look, telling the others that the bear was focused on the river and would ignore them entirely if they stayed calm. The bear raised its head. Grizzly bears detecting humans unexpectedly near a food source will often respond with a defensive charge. Running accelerates that response. The distance closes faster than any person can cover on foot. The bear turned and charged. It covered the ground between them in seconds. Stefano turned and ran, which accelerated the animal's response. The bear reached him before he covered 20 feet and struck him from behind with enough force to knock him off his feet. The attack was brief but concentrated. The bear bit down on the back of his neck and upper shoulder before the group's noise and movement caused it to break off and retreat toward the tree line. The group reached Stefano within seconds. He was conscious but unable to move. Emergency services were contacted immediately, but the remote backcountry location meant evacuation took several hours. Stefano was airlifted to a trauma facility, but did not survive. The medical examiner recorded his cause of death as fatal cervical spine injury and hemorrhagic shock resulting from crush trauma and bite injuries to the neck and upper back consistent with a grizzly bear attack. Park authorities confirmed the group had received full bear safety briefings before entering the backcountry. No citations were issued. Investigators attributed the incident to the victim approaching a feeding bear at close range against established safety guidelines. It was July 4th, 2014, at a working marina in Westport, Washington, during early evening when the docks were busy with boats, pedestrians, and seasonal marine activity along open water. Nola Harridge was 34, working as an administrative coordinator at a dental practice in Olympia. She had little experience around open water and was more comfortable in controlled indoor environments than slippery marine docks. That evening, she was visiting the marina with Neil Webb, 37, a high school biology teacher she had been dating for several months, along with his 8-year-old daughter. They stopped near the dock after noticing a group of California sea lions resting on floating platforms nearby. Several people had gathered along the edge taking photos. At K-Dock, the sea lions shifted, barked, and occasionally slipped into the water before climbing back onto the pontoon. The aluminum gangways leading toward the platforms were damp with sea spray and algae buildup, especially near the edges. People tend to underestimate how slick those walkways get once everything's wet. Nola stepped onto one of the narrow gangways to get a clearer photo, holding her phone at chest height as she moved farther out than the rest of the group. Neil called for her to step back, but she stayed focused on framing the shot as movement increased ahead. A sudden burst of splashing among the sea lions caused her to shift her footing on the wet metal surface. Her foot slid on the algae-coated edge, and she lost balance, falling forward into the water below with no time to react. The fall dropped her directly beside the floating platform, where several sea lions had already become agitated by the sudden splash. Witnesses later described the animals circling and surging through the water around her as she resurfaced near the pontoon. The cold water triggered an immediate shock response. She surfaced gasping and disoriented, struggling to orient herself toward the dock ladder. As she tried to push herself toward the supports, one of the sea lions lunged through the water and bit into her left forearm during the confusion. She screamed and pulled the arm against herself while trying to stay afloat. During the struggle, she slipped beneath the surface several times and appeared to inhale water before resurfacing again in panic. The combination of cold shock, heavy clothing, repeated submersion, and the arm injury made it harder for her to keep herself stable in the water. Once she resurfaced, she kept trying to face the dock, but the water kept throwing her off balance again. People nearby threw flotation devices toward her, but the movement in the water made them difficult to grab. Several witnesses later reported seeing more movement from the sea lions beneath the surface near her position, causing hesitation before anyone entered the water. Within moments, Neil climbed down from a nearby ladder and reached her, keeping her head above water, while others helped from the dock. She was eventually pulled out with assistance from multiple bystanders. Emergency services arrived shortly afterward. Initial assessment noted hypothermia, respiratory distress from water aspiration, and a deep forearm injury consistent with a sea lion bite. During transport, her condition worsened as breathing complications increased despite warming measures and oxygen support. She was taken to a nearby hospital, but later suffered cardiac arrest linked to cold water immersion, aspiration, and respiratory failure. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. A later safety review recommended additional warning signs, improved barriers near the gangways, and stricter controls around areas where marine wildlife gathered close to pedestrian docks. It was February 3, 2013. A small traveling circus had stopped outside a community fairground somewhere in the southeast during several days of cold rain and muddy weather. Most of the audience tents were already closed for the night, but backstage crews still moved between the trailers, organizing props, costumes, and animal equipment for the next afternoon's performances. Brian Keswick was 46 years old and had spent most of his adult life working with performing chimpanzees. Unlike the handlers in the earlier stories, Brian worked in in much closer physical contact with the animals almost every day. Feeding, grooming, rehearsals, and costume preparation usually happened only a few feet away from the chimp he handled most often. Brian believed routines stayed smoother when the animals saw him as familiar instead of threatening. He treated the chimp more like a difficult coworker than something truly dangerous. If Dustin chased excitement around the cages, Brian was almost the opposite. He relied heavily on familiarity and routine after spending years around the same animal. Working around chimpanzees came with a completely different kind of risk from the big cats earlier in these stories. Adult male chimps are extremely strong for their size and tend to lash out through grabbing, biting, pulling, and repeated physical force once they become overwhelmed or agitated during close contact situations. The problems that night started during costume preparation behind the trailers. The backstage area had become crowded with folding racks, prop bins, costume containers, and audio equipment stacked beneath the trailer awnings to keep everything out of the rain. Workers kept moving through the narrow walkways, carrying supplies, while crews prepared the animal acts for the next day. Brian brought the chimp into a preparation area beside one of the costume trailers while he adjusted part of the harness used during performances. The chimp already seemed uncomfortable with the fitting and repeatedly pulled at the straps around its shoulders while Brian tried repositioning them. At one point, the chimp suddenly jerked backward hard enough to yank part of the harness loose from Brian's hands. The movement knocked over a folding rack beside them, sending metal poles and costume pieces crashing across the wet pavement. Everything became chaotic after that. The chimp grabbed onto Brian's sleeves and pulled him sideways into the stacked equipment before nearby workers fully realized the situation had turned violent. Brian tried getting back to his feet while the chimp kept grabbing at his arms, shoulders, and head. Unlike the earlier attacks, this one never stayed still for more than a few seconds. Brian and the chimp kept crashing into bins, folding chairs, and costume racks scattered around the preparation area, while workers crowded near the entrance, yelling over each other, trying to figure out how to safely intervene. Several people hesitated once they got close because the attack had become so frantic. Every time Brian tried pulling himself away, the chimp immediately grabbed onto him again while moving around the equipment-strewn pavement outside the trailer. At one point, Brian nearly reached the opening near the trailer lane before the chimp dragged him backward by his jacket and knocked both of them into a stack of plastic prop containers. Eventually, several crew members managed to force the chimp back long enough for others to pull Brian away from the preparation area and onto the gravel beside the trailers. By then, he was barely conscious. Workers used towels and spare costume fabric to try slowing the bleeding around his arms, face, neck, and upper chest, while someone from the crew called for emergency help from the fairground office nearby. Brian died later that night after suffering severe blood loss and major injuries to the face, neck, arms, and upper body during the attack. The case was later ruled an accidental animal handling death caused by close physical contact during backstage costume preparation. For me, Brian's story feels unsettling in a different way because so much of it came from familiarity instead of fear. After hearing stories like this, it's hard not to wonder how much of circus life depended on people convincing themselves everything was still under control. It was March 4th, 2014, at a regional wildlife park in the northwestern United States, during early morning operations in the carnivore wing. Behind Exhibit 7N, a service corridor beside the snow leopard habitat became the site of a fatal containment failure. Dara Messel was 29. She grew up in Grants Pass, Oregon, a working-class logging town. Nothing fancy, just a tough, practical place. She studied wildlife biology at a public state university, then moved into zoo work pretty quickly after that, eventually ending up with the big carnivores at a mid-sized wildlife facility. People inside usually described her the same way: careful, steady, almost strict about following procedure. The kind of person who actually sticks to every rule and checklist. No incidents, no write-ups, no safety issues. Just consistent work, day in and day out. And honestly, in that kind of work, that trait usually gets treated like a strength right up until something goes wrong anyway. The enclosure had been partially redesigned the year before, adding angled safety glass along a narrow staff-side corridor. In certain morning light, especially with a bit of condensation, it could create glare and soft distortion that slightly blurred sightlines in a few sections. The resident female snow leopard showed normal territorial behavior, often staying near the far boundary of the enclosure. Overnight, a minor ventilation issue led to condensation forming on parts of the glass, reducing visibility in a small section of the corridor during early morning hours. A supervisor's arrival was delayed that morning due to a logistical issue, so routine checks in the carnivore wing were briefly paused. One keeper did a limited external observation round while waiting for clearance, following restricted access protocol during partial staffing. A secondary service panel, adjusted during earlier enrichment work, hadn't been fully secured after maintenance. It looked closed, but the latch didn't actually hold under pressure, creating an unintended connection into a narrow maintenance junction. And that's the part that tends to matter most in hindsight for me. It didn't look unsecured. While moving through the corridor for visual confirmation, Dara entered a narrow junction where sightlines were partially obstructed by angled glass and condensation. The snow leopard closed the distance almost immediately after entering the junction, making contact at close range before Dara had an opportunity to retreat. The animal seized the upper shoulder and neck region while driving forward through the confined corridor. The force of the encounter knocked her off balance and into the concrete wall beside the passage. In the restricted space, the attack continued briefly before the animal disengaged and moved deeper into the junction. Dara sustained severe bite wounds to the head, neck, and upper torso, along with extensive lacerations to the arms incurred while attempting to protect herself. She remained critically injured and unable to summon assistance. Staff response began after a delayed morning check revealed communication irregularities and an unsecured corridor entry point. Access was restricted pending animal containment confirmation, and emergency personnel arrived shortly after, but resuscitation was not possible due to the severity of injuries. Medical findings identified fatal blood loss associated with extensive neck and upper body trauma. Additional injuries included facial fractures, extensive soft tissue damage to the head and neck, and blunt force injuries consistent with secondary impact against the corridor wall. Investigators concluded that survival would have depended on immediate intervention, which was not possible due to containment requirements. A joint investigation identified a failed secondary panel latch as the primary containment breach. Contributing factors included incomplete post-maintenance verification procedures and delayed identification of the unsecured access point. The facility revised inspection protocols for all modified service panels and reinforced multi-point containment checks. The animal remained in managed care. August 30th, 2017, Ranthambore National Park, Rajasthan. Monsoon season, sky darkening by early afternoon. That was the day Priya Chandrasekhar stepped out of her hide and walked toward a nest she had spent 12 days convincing herself was safe. Priya was 31, from Mumbai. She had built a growing audience online through wildlife documentaries. Her content was serious and well-researched, and that credibility was exactly what had earned her a Young Explorer grant from a small private conservation foundation to document the maternal behavior of mugger crocodiles. Before the channel, she had produced 2 well-received wildlife short films. She knew the field, and she knew how to present herself within it, but she also had a firm view that muggers were considerably less aggressive than saltwater or Nile crocodiles, particularly around nesting behavior, and she had held that view long enough that it had stopped feeling like an opinion and started feeling like a fact. And that is where everything starts. Not at the nest, not on August 30th, right there. She had made up her mind about that animal before she ever arrived at Ranthambore, and nothing across 12 days of filming gave her a reason to question it. She arrived at Ranthambore in mid-August with filming permits. A female mugger had built a nest in a marshy section of the lake's northern margin. Park staff had marked a safety boundary around the site. Priya set up her hide at the permitted observation point roughly 60 feet from the nest. The footage was workable, but not close enough for the detail she needed. Over the following days, her confidence in the animal's stillness grew alongside her frustration with the distance. For 12 days, she filmed without incident. The female remained consistently present near the nest, sometimes partially submerged, sometimes shifting position on the bank, but never once reacting to Priya's presence at the observation point. On August 29th, Priya noted in her journal that the animal appeared to allow her presence and showed no active defensive behavior. A mugger crocodile, sitting still near its nest for 12 days, is not a habituated animal. It is a nesting female, conserving energy in the final days before hatching. The stillness is not comfort, it is preparation. That afternoon, a rain shower moved through cutting visibility across the area and shifting her camera on its tripod. Priya left the hide to reposition it, and in the reduced visibility, closed to within roughly 30 feet of the nest edge. The nest had been constructed in late July, putting it well into final incubation, the period when maternal reactivity peaks. Think about that for a second. 12 days of correct distance, careful notes, and proper protocol. Then, a rain shower shifts a camera on a tripod, and she walks out to fix it. That's the reason she was standing 30 feet from that nest. Not a bold decision, not a moment of overconfidence. A camera that needed repositioning in the rain. The most ordinary reason imaginable. The mugger crocodile reaches 8 to 10 feet at full adult size and can weigh between 150 and 400 pounds. On land, they are capable of short, explosive bursts of movement. Nesting females are highly defensive and may display warning behaviors such as hissing or head lifting, but in low visibility conditions like heavy rain, these signals can be difficult to detect, and defensive escalation can occur very quickly once a nest is approached. The female charged from the bank. In the rain and low visibility, Priya had no meaningful time to react. The impact knocked her off her feet. The bite caught her across the lower abdomen, compressing major abdominal vessels and soft tissue. She was dragged toward the water. A park ranger on patrol along the northern track noticed the disturbance and radioed for backup. Rangers reached the site within a few minutes. Priya could not be located in the water that evening. Her body was found the following morning, wedged under submerged roots at the lake margin. The cause of death was internal hemorrhage combined with drowning. The camera had been positioned to capture the nest and recorded nothing of the attack. There was nothing to withhold. The Conservation Foundation published an internal safety review after the incident. It was not made public. The nest hatched successfully 11 days later. What kept me wondering about this one is those 12 days. Every day without incident made the next one feel more manageable. 12 days of nothing built the confidence that made her walk toward that nest on day 13. The crocodile was not changing across those 12 days, but Priya was. It was the morning of August 14th, 2019, when Kingsley Delaney boarded a 30-foot snorkeling charter out of Halewa Harbor on the north shore of Oahu. Kingsley was 38 and worked as a logistics supervisor in Scottsdale. After a difficult breakup earlier that year, friends noticed he became increasingly focused on posting adventurous content online. The Hawaii trip was meant to be a fresh start. Before leaving the harbor, guides gave a safety briefing about currents, staying with the group, and avoiding marine wildlife. They specifically warned guests never to approach sharks for photos. Kingsley paid little attention, spending most of the briefing filming Instagram clips on his phone instead. The snorkel excursion went normally for the first half hour. Most guests stayed together, following the guide above coral formations and schools of fish. Kingsley spent more time adjusting his GoPro than actually looking underwater. He was repeatedly diving down, alone, trying to film dramatic angles of himself swimming toward the camera. Around 40 minutes into the excursion, a 6-foot reef shark began circling deeper beneath the group. It was not behaving aggressively. According to the crew, sharks occasionally investigated areas where snorkelers disturbed bait fish near the reef edge. The guides noticed it and began slowly steering everyone closer together. Kingsley reacted differently. Earlier in the trip, he had apparently watched a viral video of someone swimming beside a reef shark for social media. Then, Kingsley surfaced briefly and announced this was going to be insane before swimming away from the group, despite one of the guides calling after him to stop. He positioned himself several yards from the others and waited for the shark to circle back. He was more focused on camera framing than the animal itself. He extended his GoPro outward, turned partially away from the shark to angle himself into the shot, and then reached out and tapped the shark on the snout with the plastic GoPro handle. Reef sharks are generally not considered highly aggressive toward humans, but sudden contact around the head can trigger a defensive reaction. The shark whipped sideways and bit down on Kingsley's right forearm almost instantly. Several snorkelers initially thought he had screamed through his snorkel as a joke until they saw the water around him turn red. The shark released quickly and disappeared downward, but the injury was severe. The bite tore deeply into Kingsley's forearm, severely damaging muscle and severing major blood vessels near the wrist. One guide reached him within moments, while another inflated a rescue float and radioed the boat. Kingsley never fully lost consciousness, though witnesses said he became pale and disoriented almost immediately. Crew members applied a tourniquet while the captain turned back toward shore at full speed, but the bleeding had already been extensive before they reached him. Emergency responders met the boat at the harbor, and Kingsley was transported to a medical center in Honolulu for emergency surgery. Doctors attempted massive blood transfusions and vascular repair, but the damage to the arm and blood loss were too severe. Kingsley went into cardiac arrest during surgery from hemorrhagic shock caused by catastrophic blood loss. He was pronounced dead later that afternoon on August 14, 2019. Investigators later stated the shark's behavior appeared entirely defensive and consistent with sudden provocation. Crew members also confirmed that Kingsley had ignored repeated instructions not to separate from the group or approach marine wildlife. It was August 22nd, 2016, and Corvin Metz had been past the boundary post for 19 minutes when he set a GoPro on a rock at Katmai National Park, 400 meters inside a restricted zone, alone. Corvin was 29, from Missoula, working seasonally as a hiking guide and winter file clerk, and ran a small YouTube channel with a few hundred subscribers focused on unedited trail footage. The Katmai trip was his most ambitious solo journey. He traveled overland for more than 2 weeks, then arrived by float plane after completing mandatory bear safety training. For several days, he stayed near the Brooks Falls viewing platforms, filming bears in the controlled, heavily regulated areas, but later became dissatisfied with the restrictions and began seeking more isolated footage outside designated zones. It's easy to see how the controlled areas start feeling limiting when you're trying to get real footage. By late morning on one of his final days in the area, he left an authorized trail and crossed a posted boundary warning of active bear activity. Beyond it, the terrain shifted into dense creekside vegetation with uneven ground, fallen logs, and narrow water channels through mossy rock, where visibility was low and sound carried unpredictably. At roughly 400 meters beyond the boundary, he reached a section of the creek where a large adult female brown bear was feeding in shallow water. No cubs were visible. The bear remained focused on salmon activity, occasionally shifting position in the current. Corwin set a small action camera on a rock near the water and started recording, then turned on a live stream that only a few people were watching. The feed mostly showed the creek surface and the brush around it. He moved closer along the creek bank, starting at several dozen meters away and gradually reducing the distance, while narrating into his phone in a controlled, steady voice. At that range, the bear continued feeding in the shallow current, focused on salmon movement, and showing only intermittent awareness of his presence. As he advanced further, he lowered himself into a crouch within the brush, using uneven terrain and vegetation for partial cover, pausing at intervals as if gauging the animal's reaction and adjusting his position. The closer he got, the more the whole thing stopped feeling like observation and started feeling like intrusion. At closer range, the bear stopped feeding entirely and turned toward him. The bear focused fully on him, shifted forward, and began moving in his direction. The charge followed within seconds. Corvin attempted to react, but had no time to fully stand or retreat. He was struck and thrown backward into the uneven creek bank, sustaining suspected fractures and significant soft tissue trauma on impact. His phone was dislodged and fell into the water, causing the live stream to cut to distorted, intermittent audio. What followed was a brief, chaotic close-range attack. Corvin attempted to protect his head and torso with his arms as the bear remained in immediate proximity, inflicting additional traumatic injuries during a short sequence of rapid movement along the bank. The bear then disengaged and moved back toward the creek, remaining nearby and intermittently refocusing on the water and surrounding area for several minutes. After things calmed down, Corvin briefly came to a few times, moving a little, but not really able to control it, or do anything purposeful. He tried to shift himself on the ground, but couldn't hold it together for long, and his movement faded quickly. Then he slipped back out of consciousness, leaving just the sound of the creek in the background. Emergency responders reached the site after an extended response time due to terrain limitations and distance from the nearest ranger access point. He was found in critical condition and transported to a regional medical facility, but died during treatment or shortly after arrival, despite resuscitative efforts. Medical findings cited multiple fractures and severe soft tissue trauma as contributing factors. A park investigation later confirmed he had entered a restricted backcountry zone beyond clearly marked safety boundaries, and the incident was classified as preventable. Internal documentation from the case was later incorporated into ranger training materials, though the original footage was not released publicly. His social media presence was eventually removed, and public reporting remained limited to brief local coverage of a fatal bear encounter in the Katmai region. It was May 17, 2014, along the Cypress Edge Nature Trail in Collier County, Florida. You might call it routine. Her steps, her dogs, the same brackish edge. But routine is just luck that hasn't run out yet. Marla Sato was 52, widowed, and had walked her late husband's 4 rescue dogs along the swamp edge trail every afternoon for 3 years. Neighbors described her as quiet and punctual, someone who nodded and kept moving. She knew the trail well enough to step over its cypress knees without looking down. The dogs, 3 mixed breed terriers and a heavier shepherd mix, were reactive near water. Marla had recently begun letting them range closer to the embankment as temperatures climbed. Her daughter said that her broader goal had nothing to do with the swamp. She was trying to rebuild enough routine to return to part-time work. The afternoon walks were part of that effort. Now, the county had received reported observations by kayakers of a large alligator in that section 6 weeks prior, logged after kayakers spotted it on a mud shelf roughly 40 yards from the embankment. However, no trapping was initiated. American alligators in Collier County regularly exceed 11 feet and 500 pounds. They are ambush predators, holding position beneath the surface for extended periods without producing a visible ripple and committing to a strike only when proximity makes it viable. A large adult generates bite pressure widely estimated in the several thousand-pound range and initiates a death roll almost immediately after securing its grip. That afternoon, a leash handle slipped when the shepherd mix lunged after a heron. A rubber toy drifted into the shallows. All 4 dogs clustered at the edge, stepping in and pulling back, whining. The partially obscured warning sign was visible, but not readable from where she stood. The toy was maybe 3 feet into mid-thigh deep, uneven shallows, transitioning toward waist depth a few steps farther in. She stepped off the bank. 80 yards away, a retiree named Hank was on his screened porch with iced tea, half watching the tree line. He heard the dogs change and looked up. He saw a woman appearing to stand in shallow water near the bank. He then noticed the dogs barking sharply and sudden splashing at the edge, looked away briefly, and when he looked back, there was violent thrashing in the water and the woman being pulled downward. She was in uneven water, ranging from mid-thigh to waist depth depending on footing, and reaching forward when the alligator erupted from just beneath the surface at the edge and clamped its jaws on her left thigh in a single motion. The force drove her sideways. Her upper Hank heard the heavy splash, then the dogs screaming. The water spread outward, and the vegetation along the bank moved slowly, deliberately, in a way that had nothing to do with wind. Hank called 911 and told the dispatcher he thought someone might have drowned. Maybe a gator, he wasn't certain. It happened fast. According to the investigation, the alligator death rolled shortly after the initial bite, causing spiral tearing of soft tissue and dragging Marla from mid-thigh water into deeper submerged channels within feet of the bank. She had no stable footing and no leverage. The shepherd mix briefly stepped into ankle-deep water and retreated. The alligator did not resurface visibly. Investigators later concluded the animal likely retreated through submerged channels along the root system away from the immediate bank area. Collier County Sheriff's deputies arrived approximately 18 minutes after Hank's call. Recovery divers were deployed that evening. Partial remains were recovered downstream the following morning. The 4 dogs were collected by animal control after refusing to leave the bank for hours. Hank gave a brief statement to a deputy. It's heartbreaking to think that Marla's quiet determination to rebuild her life, step by step, walk by walk, ended in such a sudden, senseless way. To me, the true sadness isn't just the loss itself, but the cruel irony that her small act of courage, reaching for a toy in shallow water, became the very moment everything was stolen from her and her dogs. It was March 11, 2015. A traveling circus had pulled into an industrial warehouse lot somewhere in the Midwest after heavy rain slowed traffic along the highway overnight. Equipment trailers and animal transports were lined up beside the empty loading buildings, while workers unloaded cages under portable floodlights, reflecting off the wet pavement. Jonas Ford was 33 years old and still fairly new to handling large cats. Most of his earlier work involved loading gear, driving transport trucks, and helping crews during overnight stops before he started taking on more animal-related work. Jonas wanted badly to prove he could handle bigger responsibilities around the cages instead of being treated like extra labor. He hated looking uncertain around the older handlers and usually volunteered for jobs nobody else wanted during late-night unloads. Jonas cared so much about proving himself that slowing down sometimes felt worse to him than taking a risk. Leopards are solitary predators that rely heavily on speed and close-range reactions. Adult females can weigh over 130 pounds and are capable of sudden directional changes inside extremely tight spaces. Unlike larger cats, leopards are especially comfortable climbing and moving through confined environments. The storm that night had already complicated almost everything behind the trailers. Rainwater kept running down the metal ramps connecting the transport cages, while workers tried unloading equipment as quickly as possible before the weather got worse. Several extension lights near the rear trailers flickered on and off from moisture around the generators, leaving parts of the unloading area unevenly lit. One of the sliding divider gates inside the Leopard transport cage became stuck halfway along the track during unloading. Most of the crew stayed busy securing equipment and covering supplies from the rain, so Jonas grabbed a flashlight and volunteered to free the divider himself before the next unloading stage started. The transport enclosure was narrow enough that Jonas had to angle his shoulders slightly while moving inside. Wet metal flooring covered most of the bottom section, and rainwater dripped through gaps along the trailer roof, while thunder rolled somewhere behind the warehouse buildings. At first, the Leopard stayed, crouched near the opposite end of the divider, while Jonas worked the latch mechanism with a metal tool. The flashlight beam bounced across the cage walls every time he shifted position. Then, one of the floodlights outside suddenly shut off. The inside of the enclosure became noticeably darker almost immediately. Jonas adjusted the flashlight toward the divider track and tried stepping around a puddle near the gate rail, but his boot slipped across the wet flooring and sent him sideways into the metal divider. The sound alone triggered the reaction. The Leopard burst through the partially open divider gap before Jonas could fully stand back up. In a space that small, there was almost nowhere for him to create distance once the animal reached him. People outside the trailer heard banging against the transport walls, followed by Jonas yelling for help from inside the enclosure. Workers rushed toward the cage, but the narrow entrance made it almost impossible to safely reach him, while the Leopard continued moving around inside. Jonas tried shielding his neck while backing himself into the corner of the enclosure, but the Leopard kept lunging in the cramped space every time he moved. Workers outside could barely see through the rain and flashing light while they struggled to force the divider back across the opening using metal bars. After several attempts, the divider finally slammed enough into place for the crew to reach Jonas through the entrance gate. By then, blood had already spread across most of the wet flooring beneath him. A nearby warehouse worker used an office landline to call for help, while the circus crew worked to keep Jonas awake near the loading ramp outside the cage. Emergency responders eventually reached the lot through the flooded service road behind the warehouses. Jonas was transported out of the property alive, but he died not long afterward from severe blood loss caused by injuries to the neck and upper chest. The final findings listed the wet flooring and partially jammed divider gate as contributing factors in the incident. Investigators later ruled the death an accidental animal handling incident linked to the jammed divider gate and hazardous unloading conditions during the storm. It was August 10th, 2016, at a regional wildlife center in the southeastern United States during a late morning feeding in a big cat enclosure. The facility housed African lions managed under protected contact protocols, with feeding conducted. Tomas Juros was 44. He ran a small climate systems business and occasionally did support work for zoo facilities. He'd worked around controlled carnivore feeding setups before, mostly on the systems side rather than direct animal handling. He was helping with a scheduled feeding task that involved preparing and moving meat portions through a reinforced chute while the lions were secured in an indoor holding den. Standard procedure required full confirmation that all secondary barriers were locked before anyone got near the feeding interface. The male lion had a strong food response pattern. When feeding time got close, you could see the shift. More alert, more focused, a bit more agitated. Once prep started behind the barrier, he picked up on it immediately. Sound, scent, movement. He was locked onto all of it. He'd pace in short bursts, stop, then move again, staying close to the inner boundary. And every so often, he'd press up against the mesh in quick lunges, almost testing it, just fully tuned in to what was happening on the other side. During the transfer phase, a wheeled meat delivery cart became unstable after striking an uneven section of flooring near the entrance to the feeding race. The cart tipped over, spilling multiple prepared meat portions across the corridor and into the transfer route used for active feeding operations. The spill immediately triggered a halt in the feeding sequence. Standard protocol required suspension of active feeding operations and restriction of personnel access to the transfer race until the area could be cleared under secured conditions. The lion's attention intensified as the scent and visibility of scattered meat increased along the feeding interface. The animal paced more tightly along the enclosure boundary, tracking activity in the transfer race as cleanup efforts continued. As Thomas moved into position to assist with righting the cart and recovering spilled portions, he entered the same active feeding race where food remained scattered along the corridor. With that being said, I can kind of feel how quickly that transfer race tightens up the moment the spill happens, and everyone ends up in the same confined space. During ongoing recovery efforts, the lion gained access to the transfer race through an unsecured or partially engaged interface point during the disruption. The entry occurred rapidly, collapsing the separation between enclosure-side feeding behavior and the active transfer space. Thomas attempted to withdraw toward the service corridor, but the narrow layout of the feeding race and scattered equipment limited his movement. The lion closed the distance almost immediately, making contact at close range. Within the confined space, a bite was delivered to his upper body, and the animal maintained grip during the initial engagement, leaving little opportunity for effective escape or intervention. The encounter resulted in severe traumatic injuries, consistent with major soft tissue and vascular damage. The victim became rapidly unresponsive, with death attributed to hemorrhagic shock. Staff activated emergency containment procedures and remotely secured the enclosure, but access to the corridor remained delayed until the animal was fully contained. Thomas was pronounced dead at the scene. A post-incident investigation found that a delivery cart tip and resulting food spill during active feeding disrupted normal procedures. Investigators concluded that scattered food in the transfer race and continued personnel activity escalated animal focus and allowed rapid entry into the feeding interface zone. The facility revised protocols to require immediate suspension of feeding after any spill, full clearance of transfer areas before recovery, and stricter separation of personnel from active feeding zones. October 9th, 2016, South Africa, near the Kruger region. No moon, no wind, just a cloudy sky and whatever your headlamp could reach. That was the night Marisol Vega stepped out alone to check on an animal she had worked with for months and did not get back in. Marisol was 34, from Bogota, Colombia. She ran a crocodile-focused blog and field footage series called Croc Whisperer Diaries, documenting her Nile crocodile research work to a large online following. Before becoming a full-time creator, she had earned a PhD in herpetology and worked on a Nile crocodile population study through a regional conservation NGO and a private eco-lodge. One animal appeared in her blog more than any other, a female Nile crocodile just over 10 feet long that the team called Limping Lil, named after the way she dragged her left rear leg on land. Marisol had been part of 2 team captures of Lil without incident. Both followed standard multi-handler procedures, with the animal fully restrained before any close contact. I want to stop here for a second, because this is important. Everything described so far is a person doing their job correctly. Team captures, proper restraint, clean record. None of that is the problem. The problem starts the moment she decided to go out alone. In her blog on October 8th, she described Lil as showing the lowest disturbance level of any female in the group. That assessment was based on handling sessions where the animal was fully restrained. Behavior under restraint does not reliably predict how a crocodile responds when free and approached at the water's edge in the dark. That evening, she told her field assistant they would run a spotlight survey before dawn to locate Lil and mark the site for a team capture the following morning. The assistant would manage the vehicle and spotlight from the track. Marisol would log positions from a bank-adjacent point. Bank-adjacent means standing back with clear sightlines. It does not mean closing the distance to an unrestrained animal at the edge of a crocodile lagoon in near total darkness. What bothers me is how small that gap is between what she said she was going to do and what she actually did. She told her assistant one thing. The footprints at the lagoon edge told a different story. That distance between the plan and the decision she made in the dark alone is where this whole story lives. What investigators pieced together the following morning suggested she had moved to the water's edge rather than staying at a setback position. Lil was resting on a low mud flat at the lagoon's margin. The Nile crocodile is the second largest reptile on Earth. A female at just over 10 feet weighs between 300 and 500 pounds, capable of fast, short-distance lunges from resting positions. Their response to close approach does not build gradually. Prior handling under restraint has no bearing on how an unrestrained wild animal responds to proximity in open terrain at night. Based on scene evidence, the attack likely occurred at or near the mudflat's edge. The blood pattern, drag marks, and condition of the remains recovered were consistent with a crocodile bite and death roll. The blood loss produced by that kind of attack in that location is not survivable without immediate intervention. There was none. The issue is, those two previous captures gave Marisol real data about Lil's behavior under full restraint. They told her nothing about what Lil would do unrestrained on a mudflat in darkness. The distinction between those two situations is the entire story. The field assistant found her headlamp still lit on the bank, blood across the mud, flat, disturbed soil, and drag marks leading into the water. A search launched at first light recovered partial remains along the lagoon's margins later that day. Investigators concluded the evidence was consistent with a crocodile attack, though the exact sequence could not be reconstructed without witnesses or recording equipment. She had not been carrying a camera. There was nothing to review and nothing to release. Her field notes and blog entries were examined as part of a safety audit of the program's survey protocols. The Eco Lodge faced scrutiny over the absence of documented procedures governing solo exit from vehicles near active water. The strangest part is that her PhD was in herpetology. She knew exactly what Nile crocodiles were capable of. That knowledge did not stop her from walking toward one in the dark. It just made her feel like it was a calculated risk, rather than a blind one. It was the afternoon of September 6th, 2017, at an aquarium along the southeastern United States coastline. The facility had opened extended hours for Labor Day weekend, and attendance was unusually heavy. Several temporary employees had been brought in to manage the holiday crowd. Melissa Carver was 44 years old and worked as an office manager outside Charlotte, North Carolina. A year earlier, she had participated in a supervised shark touch tank program at a marine attraction in Myrtle Beach, and afterward spoke as though she understood shark behavior personally. Over time, she developed the habit of treating aquarium restrictions as exaggerated liability rules rather than actual safety measures. The aquarium's largest exhibit was a 400,000-gallon shark habitat containing sand tiger sharks, a nurse shark, and a 9-foot bull shark. Above the habitat sat a restricted maintenance platform used by dive staff during feeding and cleaning operations. Access required a staff keycard, and the corridor leading to the platform was clearly marked employees only. At approximately 2:10 p.m., Melissa was stopped by an employee after trying to open a maintenance access panel and was escorted back to the public area. About 20 minutes later, she returned and received a second warning for lingering near the same corridor entrance. Just after 3 p.m., during a shift change, a temporary employee briefly left the rear service hallway unattended while assisting a lost child. Investigators believed Melissa noticed the opening during the confusion, took a nearby maintenance keycard, unlocked the corridor panel, and climbed the ladder to the platform before anyone realized. The maintenance platform extended several feet over the water and was surrounded by waist-high steel railings designed for trained staff wearing secured dive harnesses during controlled operations. Security footage later showed Melissa crouching near the edge while filming the sharks below on her phone. The bull shark made several slow passes beneath the platform, while Melissa leaned farther over the railing, attempting to follow it with the camera. During feeding and close contact maintenance operations, dive staff sometimes used protective chainmail gear because bull sharks were considered one of the exhibit's least predictable species. As the shark passed beneath the platform again, Melissa shifted her weight onto the lower rail to angle her phone downward. Her footing slipped almost immediately. The railing caught one leg briefly before she lost balance completely and fell feet first into the water beside the platform. The sudden surface disturbance drew the bull shark upward. Witnesses later said the animal accelerated beneath Melissa as she resurfaced and attempted to grab the steel service ladder fixed beneath the platform. The shark lunged toward her right side, biting across her arm and shoulder before releasing. Melissa briefly managed to grab the ladder with her left hand while kicking frantically against the water. As employees rushed toward the platform above, the shark circled back once more and bit into her upper torso before moving away beneath the exhibit. Employees reached the platform moments later and immediately activated the habitat's secondary containment gates, while emergency dive staff entered the water in protective gear. Melissa was recovered from the habitat less than 2 minutes after the initial fall. She was still alive when paramedics reached the service corridor, but had suffered severe vascular injuries to her right arm, chest, and shoulder, alongside massive blood loss. Emergency responders transported her to a regional trauma center, where surgeons attempted emergency vascular repair and multiple transfusions. Melissa Carver died during surgery later that evening. The medical examiner recorded her cause of death as hemorrhagic shock resulting from traumatic injuries to the upper torso and right arm consistent with a shark attack. State investigators later concluded the enclosure itself had functioned properly and that Melissa had bypassed multiple restricted access barriers after being stopped twice earlier that afternoon. It was July 13th, 2013, and the delta channels of the Okavango system in Botswana ran cold and clear with midwinter flooding, the water high enough to push through papyrus-dense corridors in wide, transparent sheets, the banks low, the air dry, and still with the quality of the southern African winter that makes everything feel settled and contained. The channels moved with quiet purpose. Nothing about the landscape that morning suggested what was coming. Dylan Carrick was 34 years old. He worked in nightlife promotion, and his professional identity had been built around a specific capacity: the ability to dominate the social temperature of a room, to make himself the reference point in any gathering, to redirect attention toward himself when it shifted elsewhere. That capacity had its environment: a flat-bottom boat on a delta waterway occupied by a group of quietly watching tourists was not it. The group was on a guided river excursion, a small private operation run by a local guide, navigating a wooden vessel through a planned route through several channel systems. Wildlife along the margins was the explicit purpose of the trip. Midway through the excursion, the channel curved around a dense section of papyrus, and, as the bend opened, revealed a group of hippos resting directly in the water ahead at close range. The thick vegetation had concealed the animals completely until the boat was already committed to the line. The guide slowed immediately, read the positioning, and began the adjustment that would move the vessel clear of the animal's space as efficiently as the restricted channel allowed. Before he could complete that adjustment, Dylan stood up. I want to emphasize the timing, because it's central to understanding this case. The guide had already spotted the problem before the situation escalated. The boat was already moving toward the solution. The encounter was being managed by someone who understood exactly what the situation required. Then, Dylan stood up, grabbed a paddle, and began striking the water's surface repeatedly while making large, sustained gestures toward the animals. The guide was in the process of resolving the problem, Dylan converted it into something that could no longer be resolved. Hippopotamuses are the third largest land animal on Earth. An adult bull weighs between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds. They are responsible for more human fatalities annually in Africa than lions, leopards, or saltwater crocodiles, a fact that consistently surprises people who have built their mental image of hippos from their appearance rather than their behavior. Bull hippos are aggressively territorial in the water and maintain defined river sections with extreme defensive intensity. The hippo charged from its position in the channel. The approach covered the distance to the vessel in seconds, a mass exceeding 3,500 pounds moving through the water with no possibility of the hull avoiding the line of contact. The bull struck the port side with its full forward momentum. The impact transferred through the wooden hull and deck in a single pulse. Passengers were thrown hard across the boat in both directions. Dylan went over the side and into the water. The hippo, still carrying the momentum of the charge, pivoted in the water toward the entry point within seconds. Below the surface, it moved in the low, riverbed-driven push that carries a hippopotamus across short distances faster than the surface gives any indication of. The jaws opened on approach. The bite closed across Dylan's torso directly and completely. The effect on contact was immediate and absolute. He was driven beneath the surface. Dylan had built his career around getting people to look at him. On a river in Botswana, at the worst possible moment, he got exactly that. Investigators reviewing the incident found the guide's navigation appropriate given the channel conditions. The papyrus bend had concealed the animals until the vessel was already committed to the line, and his response had been immediate and correct. The conclusion was direct. A manageable situation became unmanageable the moment a passenger began deliberately provoking a territorial bull hippo from inside the space. The animal had already identified as a threat.
It was June 9, 2018, near a rocky shoreline on Oahu, Hawaii. A night of shoreline shark fishing escalated when a hooked tiger shark was drawn into ankle-deep surf and a man stepped into the water to film as the animal remained active in the surge zone.
The rocks there don't really look dangerous until you see how fast the waves run through them.
Keone Vadek, 34, worked as a warehouse forklift operator handling overnight freight loads in Kapolei. He spent most weekends shoreline fishing and increasingly prioritized close-range footage over safety while filming. He was not part of any professional filming group, but had begun posting edited clips of fishing encounters online, hoping to attract sponsorships from tackle brands. Friends described him as persistent and increasingly focused on getting close-range footage rather than safe catches. Over the past year, he shifted toward shark fishing content after seeing similar videos gain attention online. He believed proximity footage would improve his reach, even if it meant entering shallow water during active retrievals. The trip that night was informal, arranged among friends without professional safety gear or dive support, relying instead on heavy short tackle and handheld lighting. The shoreline was a mix of black volcanic rock shelves, broken coral fragments, and shallow surge channels where waves repeatedly pushed water over submerged ledges.
Standing there, you can feel how uneven everything is under the water, even when it looks calm.
Tiger sharks in Hawaiian waters commonly exceed 10 feet and can accelerate suddenly when stimulated by prey cues or turbulent surf conditions. A few fishermen actually warned him not to go into the water while the shark was still active in the shallow surge zone, noting that hooked sharks in surf conditions can roll or surge unpredictably when the line is under tension. The tide was also rising, pushing water repeatedly over the submerged rock shelves. Even so, Keone entered the water with pliers, while the others remained onshore filming. At first, the shark appeared fatigued, rolling in the surge, as the fishing line stayed tight and the surf repeatedly lifted and dropped it against the shallow reef structure. Keone edged closer toward the leader line as people called out from shore. As a wave cycle pushed the shark sideways across the rocks, its body twisted sharply under line tension and breaking surf energy. In the resulting turbulence, it made accidental contact with Keone's left arm as he leaned in, knocking him off balance into the surge. A second brief contact occurred moments later as both the shark and Keone were displaced by the same wave set, pushing him back toward the rocks during the chaotic movement of water, line tension, and submerged terrain.
That stretch of rock shelf leaves almost nowhere stable to step once you're in the wash.
Friends tried pulling on his fishing harness while the shark was still close by, moving unpredictably just a few yards away in the rough surf. Someone immediately called emergency services, and responders arrived about 24 minutes later via a nearby coastal road. The coroner report listed catastrophic blood loss from severe upper limb vascular and soft tissue trauma consistent with a large shark bite. He was unconscious during transport and later pronounced dead at the hospital. The incident circulated among local fishing groups after cell phone footage showed the shoreline response and the sudden retreat from the water. Experienced anglers later cited repeated mistakes, including entering surf water with an active large shark still uncontained and prioritizing filming over clearing the line zone. After that, the fishing group just stopped going to that shoreline for a while and switched to deeper offshore trips where everything was handled from boats instead of the rocks. People living near the access point later said people just kind of stayed away from those lava rocks for a while. And most anglers actually moved over to offshore fishing instead of messing around in that shoreline stretch. Local authorities later reiterated that shoreline shark handling in shallow surf creates unpredictable risk when animals are still mobile and unrestrained. Investigators noted that the combination of rising tide, submerged rock shelves, and proximity filming reduced reaction time to seconds rather than minutes. Keawe's friends reportedly stopped posting fishing content for a period after reviewing the footage privately.
The shoreline remained open, but was informally avoided by, many anglers who preferred offshore boat-based shark releases after the incident, in the years that followed.
It was November 22nd, 2017. A traveling circus had stopped outside a small fairground somewhere in the upper Midwest near the end of its touring season. Patches of old snow still sat along the trailer lanes, and most of the animal enclosures remained closed through the afternoon to keep heat inside. Walter Brees was 57 years old and had spent most of his life performing with bears in smaller circus acts. Unlike the younger crews constantly moving between jobs, Walter had stayed with the same act for years and built most of his daily life around the rehearsal routines. He still treated the performances the same way he had decades earlier, even as both he and the animals got older. Walter struggled to accept how much the bear had slowed down physically over time. Continuing the act had become deeply personal to him, almost like stopping would mean admitting that part of his life was over too. By that point, the bear involved in the act was already getting old for an animal that size. Adult brown bears can weigh more than 700 pounds, and older captive bears often start developing joint pain, balance problems, and slower movement after years of transport and performance routines. The problems started during rehearsal setup that evening. Workers moving equipment around the practice tent noticed the bear hesitating near the trailer ramp while being guided toward the ring area. The animal moved slower than usual across the frozen gravel and shifted awkwardly while stepping over the entrance track leading into the tent. At one point, it paused near the edge of the ramp long enough that one of the crew members had to help steady the lead chain before the bear continued moving again. Walter noticed the hesitation too, but he still wanted to finish the rehearsal before the next day's performances started. Inside the tent, portable heaters rattled beside the seating rows while workers adjusted lighting rigs above the practice ring. The rehearsal itself was simple and mostly involved movement cues and positioning around a raised wooden platform near the center of the sawdust floor. Walter guided the bear into the ring using a lead pole attached near the harness collar while workers finished adjusting equipment around the tent. The animal already seemed uncomfortable inside the rehearsal space, repeatedly shifting its weight near the edge of the sawdust ring instead of staying still between cues. Trouble started when Walter tried guiding the bear onto the raised platform. The bear's back leg slipped against the wooden edge and its full weight shifted sideways. Walter tightened the lead pole trying to correct it, but the bear lurched further off balance and dropped onto all four, twisting toward him. Not with aggression, just 600 pounds of disoriented animal with no stable footing beneath it. The lead pole caught Walter across the forearm on the way loose. He stumbled backward against the platform edge and went down into the sawdust just as the bear came down on top of him. What followed wasn't a mauling in the way people imagine one. There was no roaring, no frenzy. The bear was disoriented and in pain, and Walter was directly beneath it. The bear came down across his torso and drove the air from his lungs. He tried to roll, but was already pinned against the platform support. The bear's weight redistributed awkwardly as it struggled to right itself, pressing down across his ribcage with increasing force. Several ribs gave way in the first few seconds. Walter managed one short cry before the compression became too severe for his lungs to move air. The bear swiped downward twice while trying to push itself upright. The first swipe caught Walter across the left shoulder and upper chest, tearing through his jacket and the skin beneath. The second connected with the left side of his head. His skull struck the wooden support beam behind him. Workers started banging metal equipment against the barriers and dragging noisy carts toward the ring. Sawdust lifted into the air. Another handler eventually redirected the bear back toward the holding corridor, using food containers and compressed air near the entrance gate. When they reached Walter, he was unresponsive. Blood had soaked through the sawdust around the platform support. Emergency crews arrived shortly after, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause was crushing injuries to the chest and severe blunt trauma to the head. It was January 14, 2016, at a zoological research facility in the Midwestern United States during morning operations in a primate behavioral research complex. Inside a secured chimpanzee habitat system, a routine maintenance procedure escalated into a fatal animal attack. Seren Malik was 31. She was doing her doctorate in applied animal behavior and environmental acoustics at a public university in Wisconsin. Her work mostly looked at how controlled sound environments affect stress in captive primates. So in this case, she'd been brought in by the facility's research team to help calibrate an experimental sound system they'd installed in a few enclosures. The primate area itself had a small group of chimpanzees, set up in a multi-zone layout. There was an outdoor space, an indoor holding area, and then a narrow service corridor separated by reinforced shift doors. And normally, procedure was pretty strict there. Before anyone stepped into those service areas, every door lock had to be fully checked and confirmed as engaged mechanically. Malik entered the service corridor alone during a scheduled low activity period to recalibrate an acoustic emitter mounted along the inner enclosure wall. System logs indicated the chimpanzees were believed to be secured in the outdoor section of the habitat, though a secondary lock indicator on an indoor shift door had failed to confirm full engagement after a prior transfer cycle. While Malik worked at the emitter panel, one adult male chimpanzee had been shifted through a normal movement cycle into the indoor holding area, but during ongoing internal handling activity, it was redirected through an already open internal transfer route used for routine movement between zones. This route remained part of the active circulation system within the habitat, and the timing of its use overlapped with maintenance activity in the adjacent service corridor. That part always gets me, because it's not random aggression. It's directed, focused, and it builds fast in tight spaces. The chimpanzee was moved into the indoor holding area earlier than scheduled during a routine transfer adjustment, while maintenance was still ongoing in the adjacent service corridor. The updated status was not fully communicated in time, resulting in both activities overlapping within connected areas of the system. Malik attempted to retreat toward the nearest exit, but the narrow corridor layout and equipment staging significantly limited movement. The chimpanzee rapidly closed distance and initiated close-range aggressive behavior consistent with territorial escalation and immediate threat response. I don't think that ever feels as slow as it sounds afterward. It made direct physical contact, knocking her to the ground and continuing repeated biting and striking in short bursts. The confined space prevented separation, and sustained contact led to rapidly progressing traumatic injuries and severe blood loss. She became unresponsive within a short period as the injuries escalated. Staff were alerted by enclosure alarms indicating unexpected door status changes and movement within a restricted corridor. Emergency containment protocols were initiated, and the chimpanzee was secured using secondary locking systems before responders were permitted to enter and confirm conditions inside the service area. Malik was recovered unresponsive and pronounced dead at the scene. A post-incident investigation determined that the primary cause of death was a containment failure, allowing direct access between a chimpanzee and a maintenance corridor, compounded by incomplete verification of shift door locking status and failure of redundant mechanical safeguards. The report concluded that fatal injuries resulted from a rapid escalation of aggression following unauthorized enclosure access during maintenance operations. The facility later implemented dual confirmation locking systems, upgraded primate barrier reinforcement standards, and required two-person verification for all service corridor entry adjacent to primate habitats. On April 17, 2015, the East Alligator River in Australia's Northern Territory sat murky and still in the late afternoon heat. That was the day Cassandra Mears stepped off a small tin boat at Cahill's Crossing and walked toward the water's edge with her camera running. Cassie was 29, running a YouTube channel and Instagram page with just under 9,000 followers, built around close encounters with dangerous animals. Before the channel, she had spent several years at a small regional wildlife education center, running presentations on reptiles and birds of prey. She genuinely wanted to make dangerous animals feel less threatening to ordinary people. To push that idea further, she quit and started creating content full-time. The problem was that the videos pulling the most views were always the ones where she was closest to the animal. Every time the gap shrank, the numbers went up. And every time the numbers went up, the gap shrank further. Every upload was a small bet that the next one would be safe too. The odds never changed, only the stakes did. She had spent 4 days filming from a small tin boat along quieter stretches of river south of the main visitor zone. Then, on April 16th, a video close to a juvenile crocodile pulled strong numbers overnight. The next morning, she moved toward Cahill's Crossing, one of the most consistently active crocodile locations in the region, framing the trip publicly as a wildlife observation session. The saltwater crocodile is the largest living reptile on Earth. A fully grown male typically reaches 10 to 13 feet and can weigh between 900 and 1,500 pounds. In tidal river systems, crocodiles may position themselves in shallower margins where prey is more concentrated. They are highly stealthy ambush predators, and in many attacks, the strike is the first moment the target becomes aware of the threat. Cassie stood on the low sandbank with her camera pointed at the water. The crocodile gave no warning and stayed completely hidden just below the surface. In a sudden burst, it surged out of the water and grabbed her. She was pulled into the river almost immediately. Once in the water, it began a powerful twisting motion with its body, a spinning death roll used to control the prey, disorient it, and help drag it under. Within seconds, she was fully submerged. That is what people miss when they hear about moments like this. It does not build. It does not give anyone time to respond. It is over before the person watching has processed what they are seeing. Cassie's body was recovered 36 hours later, nearly 1,000 feet downstream. The cause of death was recorded as traumatic asphyxiation, severe drowning, and crushing injuries to the torso and limbs. The camera recovered at the river's edge was taken by Northern Territory Police as part of a coronial investigation. Under Australian coronial law, footage depicting a fatality cannot be publicly released while the inquest remains open. The recording has never been made available. And what stays with me about this is how it didn't come down to one big mistake. It was a series of small steps that slowly brought a person too close to something that never changed what it was. Each decision felt small in the moment, but the danger was always the same in the background. One moment, everything seems fine, and the next moment it isn't, and by then, it's already too late to fix it.
It was May 12, 2026. On the northeastern side of Kodiak Island, Alaska, a spring hunt deep inland near a floatplane inlet turned into a fatal bear encounter as dense brush and lingering snow patches compressed sound and visibility into a tight, silent corridor. Melva Sarin, 53, worked night shifts at a packaging warehouse in rural eastern Oregon while raising 3 children after an early divorce. Hunting had become both a long-term personal goal and a practical source of food, delayed by work demands and progressively worsening joint pain that limited her mobility. She had spent years planning an Alaska hunt that she and her daughter Talia would complete together. Talia Sarin, 29, worked as a home care aide in a small retirement facility and had been hunting alongside her mother for several years. The Alaska trip was one of the biggest hunts they had ever planned together and represented a shared milestone before her mother's physical condition declined further. They traveled with a small outfitter operating a basic canvas camp in remote inland terrain.
It sounds less like a hunting trip and more like time they wanted to spend together.
Brown bears on Kodiak Island are among the largest coastal grizzlies, with males often exceeding 800 to 1,000 pounds and capable of short bursts of high speed. Their sense of smell is highly developed and can detect carrion from long distances under favorable wind conditions. By late spring, they often move inland to feed on winter-killed animals and other food sources exposed by melting snow, increasing the likelihood of close encounters. Earlier that day, a wildlife advisory had warned there was more bear activity in the inland drainages because of the thaw. The guide told everyone to stick close and keep each other in sight, but the two women ended up drifting a bit behind while following deer tracks through thick salmonberry and fallen timber. Talia detected a strong carrion odor in the brush. The guide slowed the group and prepared bear spray. Moments later, movement ahead stopped, followed by breaking branches and a sudden lack of ambient forest noise.
That smell would have gotten my attention immediately.
The bear emerged from the alder thicket at close range, under 20 feet, moving low and fast with almost no warning. The guide immediately fired at the charging animal, but the shot failed to stop its momentum as it closed the remaining distance. Talia deployed bear spray, but the wind carried much of it off target, reducing its effect before the bear reached them. The impact threw Melva backward into snow and buried timber, causing severe, blunt trauma to the torso and head region that left her disoriented and unable to stand or effectively orient herself. The bear pinned her upper body and bit into her shoulder and neck, shaking violently and tearing through clothing and gear. The guide hesitated briefly under the rapidly evolving threat as Talia moved into his line of fire. Talia moved toward her mother and briefly made contact with her clothing in an attempt to pull her clear. The bear released Melva and immediately redirected toward Talia at close range, knocking her to the ground. She sustained a severe bite to the lower back and was dragged through brush as she called for help.
The guide fired again and hit the bear, but it still didn't break off. It stayed on top of Talia and caused severe neck injuries. And after that, she lost movement very quickly.
The guide used a satellite phone to request emergency assistance and transmitted coordinates. Due to fog, terrain, and limited inland access routes, evacuation was delayed, and responders arrived approximately 2 hours later via coordinated boat and overland transport. Talia was declared deceased at the scene with no viable opportunity for immediate medical intervention. Wildlife officers later located and euthanized the bear approximately half a mile from the site near a suspected carcass area in dense brush. Preliminary assessments suggested defensive behavior likely associated with a nearby food source during spring scavenging conditions, though full investigation findings would depend on further analysis. The outfitter temporarily suspended operations pending review before later resuming limited spring hunts under state regulations. The incident received brief attention within regional hunting communities. Family members arranged transport and burial in Oregon following official release of remains. It was September 3rd, 2016, roughly 2 miles off the north shore of Oahu, Hawaii. That day, there was a shape moving in the water, and a man had been methodically building toward the worst decision of his life for the better part of a decade. Nico Darrow was 47, self-employed, and spent most of his working hours in the water, whether he was being paid to be there or not. He ran a one-man boat repair operation out of Haleiwa, was known on the docks as someone who finished jobs on time and charged fairly, and had a reputation for knowing the local waters better than people who made their living on them. Diving was not a weekend hobby for him. He logged between 200 and 300 dives a year, mostly reef dives along Oahu's north shore, and had been doing so consistently since his late 20s. What had changed in recent years was his framing of those dives. Nico had developed a working theory, shared across several diving forums and a personal blog he updated inconsistently, that shark behavior could be modulated by a diver's posture, movement rate, and sustained eye contact. Now, according to his friends, he had spent years documenting close interactions with white-tip and black-tip reef sharks and had accumulated enough incident-free encounters to treat his theory as confirmed rather than speculative. He called it calibrated presence. Other divers in his circle called it something else behind his back. The site group had selected that morning was a known aggregation point for tiger sharks. Tiger sharks are the second most dangerous shark species in documented human attacks. Adults regularly exceed 11 feet and 1,000 pounds, with bite forces sufficient to sever limbs and crush bone in a single closure. Before entering the water, the charter operator briefed the group of 5 on shark safety. A reef guide noted that a large female tiger shark had been seen in the area days earlier and advised maintaining distance and proper positioning if encountered. About 18 minutes into the dive, a tiger shark appeared at roughly 50 feet, circling within about 30 feet of the group. Witnesses later estimated it was an adult female measuring around 12 to 13 feet long. The 4 experienced divers held position, maintained vertical orientation, and created deliberate space by moving slowly rearward as a tight, coordinated group. Nico did not. His GoPro, recovered later, captured him narrating to the camera in real time, describing the shark's body language as non-threatening, her circling pattern as measured and communicative, and his own decision to move toward her as an extension of his established methodology. He closed to within 8 feet and extended his left arm toward her snout. The shark turned in under a second and seized his forearm. The torque from her initial bite spun him 90 degrees in the water column. The GoPro captured the rotation as a blur of reef, surface light, and then nothing recognizable. He attempted to pull the arm back. The shark released, circled for approximately 4 seconds, and returned. The second bite landed across the left chest and shoulder, and the compression was sufficient to register on the audio track of the GoPro as a low, muffled impact and heavy vibration before the footage dissolved into bubbles and erratic movement. Witnesses described blood and tissue becoming visible in the water column almost immediately after the second bite. 2 divers used camera housings and fins to strike at the shark's head and flanks, creating enough interruption for a third diver to pull Nico upward while the shark held distance. His arm below the elbow was not recoverable. The charter vessel reached him within 4 minutes of surfacing. The Coast Guard arrived approximately 25 minutes later, but by then he had lost significant amounts of blood and died. Death was ultimately ruled accidental, and the GoPro footage was never posted publicly. Here's the thing. You don't spend years learning about shark behavior just to ignore every rule and stick your hand at a 12-foot tiger shark.
That's not confidence. That's a man so in love with his own theory that he forgot the shark never read his blog.
It was March 3rd, 2018, on an isolated stretch of river in northern Queensland, Australia, beside remote wetlands known for crocodile activity during certain seasons. The area was sparsely populated, with narrow river channels used mostly by fishermen and nearby landowners. Zoe Caldwell was 34 years old and trying to rebuild her life after a brutal divorce. Her ex-husband, Ezra Caldwell, had used expensive lawyers during the custody battle over their 8-year-old daughter and accused Zoe of instability and reckless behavior throughout the proceeding. The allegations damaged her reputation, cost her friendships, and helped Ezra gain primary custody. By the end of the divorce, Zoe had lost her home, most of her savings to legal fees, and nearly all contact with the social circle they once shared. The only major asset still connecting them was a neglected riverside property jointly owned during the marriage. Developers had recently shown interest in buying the land as tourism projects slowly expanded through northern Queensland. Ezra repeatedly pressured Zoe to sign away her remaining ownership share so the sale could move forward. Friends and relatives later confirmed their relationship had become openly hostile, especially regarding custody and money. And I want you to understand what Zoe had already lost before that day even started. Her daughter, her home, her savings. The only thing she had left was that property. On the morning of March 3rd, they traveled together to inspect the property before final paperwork could proceed. Witnesses later recalled visible tension between them before they even left town. Throughout the day, they argued repeatedly about their daughter, the divorce, and the property sale. To reach the main road before dark, they used a small aluminum motorboat kept near the property for crossing the river channels. Investigators later described the boat as old, unstable, and poorly maintained. Near sunset, the engine began sputtering and eventually stalled while they drifted through a narrow section of river bordered by reeds and mangroves. As Ezra attempted to restart the motor, the argument escalated again. Zoe later claimed Ezra became aggressive and grabbed her arm during the confrontation. Investigators documented bruising consistent with a forceful grip, though they could not determine exactly when it happened. The boat rocked sharply as Ezra shifted his weight near the edge while pulling the starter cord. Zoe said she panicked when he grabbed her and instinctively shoved him away to free herself. Ezra lost balance and fell backward into the river. The splash triggered immediate movement nearby. Saltwater crocodiles are ambush predators, known to investigate violent disturbances in the water, especially near dusk. Ezra surfaced, shouting and trying to grab the side of the boat before a large crocodile lunged from the water and clamped onto his leg. Zoe later told investigators she heard him scream once before the crocodile rolled violently and dragged him beneath the surface. For several seconds, the water churned with mud and foam before going still again. Ezra surfaced only once more, briefly screaming for help before disappearing under the water entirely. His body was recovered downstream nearly 2 days later, with injuries consistent with a crocodile attack. Zoe returned alone and contacted authorities in a visibly distressed state. Investigators initially treated the death as a tragic accident involving dangerous wildlife and the failing boat. Suspicion grew after detectives uncovered the couple's vicious custody dispute, financial conflicts, and inconsistencies in Zoe's timeline of events. Despite widespread rumors, investigators never found enough evidence to prove intentional murder. No witnesses saw the fall. Forensic evidence on the boat proved inconclusive, and prosecutors could not disprove Zoe's claim that she reacted instinctively during a struggle. No charges were ever filed. Months later, Zoe attended Ezra's burial beside their daughter, while whispers spread quietly through the crowd. Officially, it remained a boating accident followed by a crocodile attack. Unofficially, many believed Ezra Caldwell had not simply fallen into that river by chance. It was July 3rd, 2014. A small traveling circus had stopped beside an old highway rest area somewhere in the south, setting up on a dry gravel lot surrounded by empty service roads and open grass fields. The animal cages sat directly behind the main tent under the afternoon heat, and even by sunset, the temperature was still sitting around 94 degrees. Alan Noren was 38 years old and had worked with lions for most of his adult life. He moved between small touring circuses for years, usually taking handling jobs nobody else wanted. Alan had a habit of forcing routines whenever animals stopped cooperating, especially during rehearsals or feeding. He hated slowing things down for safety checks and got irritated easily when performances fell behind schedule. Alan believed difficult animals needed to be pushed through bad behavior instead of worked around. Over time, frustration started shaping the way he handled problems around the cages. Deep down, Alan saw every difficult animal as something he needed to prove himself against. The more unpredictable they became, the harder he pushed himself to stay in control. Adult male lions can weigh over 500 pounds and are built for short bursts of speed and power rather than long movement. Even in captivity, they remain highly territorial animals and rely heavily on body language, eye contact, and physical positioning during interactions with handlers. A delayed supply truck pushed feeding back for hours, leaving one of the lions restless and pacing around the enclosure through most of the afternoon heat. Even with all that going on, Alan kept preparing for the show like normal. A little before sunset, he entered the holding enclosure, carrying a feeding bucket and a short handling stick used during rehearsals. Another worker stayed outside, nearby stacking equipment cases, but Alan handled the enclosure alone. The holding cage was small and temporary, built with chain fencing and a sliding divider gate connected to the trailer behind it. Years of working around lions had made Alan unusually comfortable inside spaces most people would avoid completely. At first, the animal stayed near the back section watching him. Alan set the bucket near the gate and tried guiding the lion toward the divider before feeding, but the animal ignored the commands and kept pacing along the fence instead. Alan grew frustrated and stepped closer, striking the ground with the handling stick to force the animal back. The pacing only became faster, and the lion's tail started twitching sharply while it circled near the fencing. Then, the animal suddenly stopped moving altogether. For a second, everything inside the enclosure went still. The lion lunged across the cage almost immediately afterward and slammed Alan sideways into the chain fencing hard enough to shake the entire panel. Workers outside heard the metal snap loudly before the shouting started. Alan tried getting back up, but the lion hit him again before he could reach the gate. The animal dragged him down onto the gravel and bit into his torso while pinning him beneath its front weight. Dirt and rocks kicked across the enclosure, while Alan tried pulling himself toward the fence using one arm. The worker outside grabbed a metal pole and started striking the fencing, while another crew member rushed over carrying a fire extinguisher. They sprayed through the chain links, trying to force the lion backward, but the enclosure was too cramped for anyone to safely enter. At one point, the lion released its grip briefly, and Alan tried crawling toward the side gate. Before he could reach it, the animal lunged again and dragged him back across the gravel. By the time workers finally managed to separate the lion behind the rear divider, Alan had already lost a dangerous amount of blood. Large injuries across his stomach and chest were bleeding heavily onto the gravel floor near the fencing. Responders had trouble finding the correct access road behind the circus lot and arrived roughly 20 minutes later. Alan was still lying beside the fence when help finally reached the cage area. He died at the scene shortly afterward from severe blood loss and internal injuries caused by the attack. In the aftermath, feeding buckets and bent sections of chain fencing still remained scattered across the gravel where the struggle had started earlier that evening. Investigators later questioned several circus workers about the delayed feeding schedule, extreme heat, and handling decisions leading up to the attack. The death was ultimately ruled an accidental animal handling incident, and the Lion Act was temporarily suspended afterward. It was March 18th, 2014, at a Metropolitan Zoo in the central United States during an afternoon maintenance shift in the Hippo facility. In a submerged concrete maintenance alcove beneath the main pool, a routine inspection turned fatal after a hippopotamus entered the same connected water channel as the worker. The guy involved was Bram Saul. He was 33 and worked as a keeper in the zoo's mammal division. He'd been around the facility for a few years and was pretty familiar with the day-to-day maintenance side of things. He wasn't actually one of the main keepers assigned to the hippos, but he knew the procedures and had worked around the habitat before. The facility consisted of interconnected pools and service channels designed so water could circulate between sections, with a submerged maintenance alcove used for access to pumps and pressure systems. Movement between compartments depended heavily on water levels, flow conditions, and animal positioning in adjacent pools. A female hippopotamus, weighing over 3,000 pounds, occupied the exhibit. Hippos are highly territorial in water and can shift from passive movement to sudden defensive acceleration when they detect vibration, pressure changes, or nearby motion in their environment. I don't really sit with what 3,000 pounds moving fast in water actually means in a space like that. Bram entered the submerged maintenance alcove after reviewing notes indicating the animal was positioned in the far outdoor pool section. The space was considered stable for entry based on current water levels and expected animal location. While Bram was inside the submerged alcove, the hippo moved through one of the connected water channels like it normally would in the system. With the water already churning a bit and visibility dropping, it wasn't really clear where one section ended and another began. The animal ended up coming into the same interface area near the alcove while the work was still going on. Something in me can't ignore how quickly a sealed space stops behaving like one once pressure shifts. Visibility in the submerged channel was already limited by depth and enclosure design, making movement within the connected system difficult to track from inside the alcove. The hippopotamus entered the connected channel system and moved into the same confined water space as the maintenance alcove. Bram attempted to reposition toward the access ladder as the situation changed, but the confined structure of the alcove limited his escape route. At the same time, the hippopotamus moved through the connected channel system and entered the same maintenance interface space. Contact occurred in close quarters within the water-filled alcove as visibility dropped and turbulence increased. The hippo's mass and forward momentum in the confined environment forced Bram against the structure of the chamber, resulting in severe blunt force trauma and rapid incapacitation. Staff became aware of the incident after system alarms and monitoring alerts indicating irregular water flow and access instability. Emergency response was initiated, but access was delayed until the animal was secured and water flow was stabilized to prevent further risk. A post-incident investigation determined that the fatality resulted from the hippopotamus entering a connected maintenance access channel while a worker was present, leading to entrapment in a confined, submerged space. Contributing factors included reduced visibility from turbulence and limited separation between service channels and active animal flow routes. Following the incident, the facility redesigned submerged access points to reduce shared water pathways between maintenance alcoves and active hippo movement channels, and implemented stricter controls on water flow conditions during all underwater inspections.
It was June 9, 2019, at a wildlife park near Orlando, Florida. Visitors gathered around a demonstration arena to watch trained handlers perform professional alligator wrestling shows. Caso Pedro was 44 years old and worked as a market research consultant in Atlanta, Georgia. He had been sent to Florida by his employer for meetings and was spending his remaining free time at local attractions before flying home. The following day was his 45th birthday. Friends and co-workers described him as outgoing and confident. He was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately started talking, and he rarely backed down from anything he had already decided to do. Caso attended a professional alligator wrestling demonstration. The trainer explained how dangerous alligators were and described the years of training required before anyone was allowed to work with them. After the show, Caso approached the performer and told him he believed he could do the same thing. The trainer immediately disagreed and explained that alligator handling required extensive experience. Cosil said he had grown up around lakes and rivers. The trainer told him that had nothing to do with it. I think about that conversation a lot. A professional with years of experience telling him directly to his face that he was not qualified. And Caso decided he knew better. That level of confidence is something I genuinely cannot explain. Staff began preparing for the next demonstration. Caso noticed employees were focused elsewhere and climbed over a maintenance gate marked authorized personnel only. Staff shouted for him to stop the moment they saw him on the barrier, but he was already inside. Inside the enclosure was a 9-foot alligator named Gerald. Witnesses recorded him smiling at a camera as he walked toward Gerald. The alligator's head turned, tracking his movement. What people do not understand about alligators is that they require almost no warning time. They are not mammals that build aggression in visible stages. They process a stimulus and they act. Gerald had been trained to work with specific handlers in specific ways. Caso was none of those things. Gerald launched forward, covering the short distance with startling speed. Caso's smile disappeared. He turned to run, but there was not enough time. Gerald's jaws closed on his right leg just below the knee with a bite force that caused catastrophic damage on contact. Witnesses later reported hearing a sharp cracking sound. Caso went down hard onto the concrete. Gerald immediately began dragging him toward the demonstration pool. Alligators pull their targets toward water because that is where they are dominant. Caso's fingers scraped the concrete, trying to find something to grip. Gerald rolled as they reached the edge, pulling him into the water. The rolling continued underwater, worsening the leg injury with each rotation. Caso's head went under. His screaming stopped. Park staff separated Gerald from Caso within moments and pulled him from the water, but the injuries were catastrophic. He was transported to a hospital where surgeons operated for hours. Despite their efforts, he died from massive traumatic injuries and blood loss. Investigators determined that Caso had entered the restricted area after being told he was not qualified. Multiple visitors had recorded parts of the incident on their phones. Those recordings were collected by investigators as evidence. Florida wildlife authorities reviewed them as part of the incident report, and they have not been released publicly. The park also declined to share any of its own surveillance footage, citing the sensitivity of the circumstances and ongoing review by state regulators.
It was the 25th of May, 2018, when Madison and Brittany arrived at a privately owned wildlife rescue park known for keeping rescued exotic animals, including a captive leopard. The aging facility sat beside a rural highway and had faced ongoing criticism for understaffing and weak safety procedures. Madison, 29, and Brittany, 28, had grown up together in the same struggling neighborhood and remained inseparable into adulthood. After high school, they worked together at a supermarket and trusted each other completely. Madison dreamed of becoming a nurse, while Brittany constantly encouraged her. Eventually, Madison earned acceptance into an overseas nursing program. The acceptance email arrived while both women were eating dinner together. Brittany hugged her and helped organize travel documents. Secretly, however, jealousy had already consumed her. Because they shared access to each other's devices, Brittany later deleted emails from the nursing school and hid deadline notices. By the time Madison contacted the school herself, the deadline had passed, and her place had already been given to another student. I want to sit with that for a second. She sat across the dinner table, hugged her, helped her pack, and then went home and deleted the emails. That is not a moment of weakness. That is a plan. Years later, Brittany unexpectedly reconnected with Madison, apologizing for losing touch. She had deleted those emails and then shown up years later acting like nothing had happened. Near the end of the trip, Madison suggested visiting the wildlife rescue park. During a behind-the-scenes tour, guests were briefly allowed near maintenance sections, while staff prepared animals for enclosure transfers. At one point, the tour guide stepped away to assist workers handling the leopard transfer, leaving the small group briefly unattended beside the corridor system. In the confusion of staff moving around her, Brittany drifted a few steps into a maintenance passage, mistaking it for part of the guided route. Madison saw it happen. She said nothing. She did not call out to the tour guide. She did not alert the handlers working nearby. She simply stepped back with the remaining guests and waited. The transfer was already underway. Handlers were operating on a tight rotation and had not completed a proper corridor clearance check, a shortcut the understaffed facility had normalized over time. With the tour group appearing to have moved on, they proceeded. The leopard, already agitated by the disruption of the transfer, entered the connected passage within moments. Brittany's screams lasted only seconds before workers realized something had gone wrong. Emergency alarms were triggered, but by the time staff reached her, she was dead. Authorities immediately focused on Madison because she was the last person seen near Brittany before the group moved on. Investigators grew suspicious after uncovering the nursing school sabotage, which established both motive and a prior pattern of deliberate concealment. Madison maintained she had simply not noticed Brittany wander off. The park's systemic safety failures and the absence of any direct physical evidence gave prosecutors little to work with. No murder conviction was secured. It was October 18th, 2015. A traveling circus had set up outside a small farming town somewhere in the Midwest, operating from a dusty fairground lot surrounded by gravel roads and open fields. Behind the main tent sat rows of trailers, portable fencing, generators, and animal cages packed tightly together after weeks of non-stop travel. Scott Rosley was 41 years old and had spent most of his adult life working around big cats for small independent circus crews. He handled feeding, transport, rehearsals, and cleanup, basically whatever needed to get done. He was experienced, but also extremely comfortable around the animals, to the point where he sometimes ignored smaller safety steps because nothing bad had happened before. The white tiger he worked with most often had been traveling with the show for years, and Scott was considered the main handler whenever the animal needed to be moved. According to one worker, Scott used to say the animal was easier to read than most people he'd worked with. White tigers are Bengal tigers with a rare color mutation, not a separate species. Adult males can weigh more than 450 pounds and can react aggressively when stressed or cornered. Loud noise, flashing lights, unfamiliar movement, and confined spaces can all affect their behavior, especially during transport or crowded events. Earlier that evening, workers had already been dealing with electrical issues around the main tent. One of the lighting rigs kept flickering during rehearsals, and a few crew members later said they smelled overheating wires backstage before the audience even arrived. Then, midway through the performance, part of the overhead lighting suddenly sparked out. Bright flashes lit up the tent before sections of the power cut off completely. Once the alarm started going off, the crowd rushed toward the exits while backstage crews scrambled to secure the animals. Scott was already used to dealing with stressful situations around the cages, so instead of backing away from the chaos, he moved straight toward it. The tiger had already been pacing hard inside the holding cage before the evacuation began. It kept circling in tight loops, smacking its shoulder against the divider bars and flicking its tail around. Big cats in captivity sometimes develop repetitive stress behavior, like that after long transport schedules, and this circus had been moving almost non-stop for weeks. One of the divider latches inside the corridor had not fully locked during the confusion. Scott ended up heading into the transfer corridor alone. The corridor connected the holding cage to the transport trailer. It was narrow, less than 4 feet wide in some spots, with metal walls on both sides and sliding divider gates separating the animal sections. At some point during the evacuation, the backup lights behind the trailers also failed, leaving most of the corridor dim except for a few weak emergency bulbs. Scott entered the corridor carrying a flashlight and moved toward the outer trailer gate to secure it before moving the animal. At some point during the struggle, the flashlight hit the metal wall and dropped onto the floor, leaving most of the corridor nearly dark. The tiger shoved against the divider, hard enough to force part of it open. In that tight corridor, Scott barely had space to react before the animal lunged into the passageway and slammed him into the metal wall. People outside the trailers suddenly heard a loud crash, followed by shouting and heavy banging coming from inside the corridor. Evidence at the scene showed Scott tried pulling himself toward the exit while the tiger kept hold of him near the floor. Deep bite injuries around the neck and shoulder caused severe bleeding very quickly. There were also large claw injuries across his upper chest and back from where the animal pinned him down in the narrow passage. Nearby workers tried forcing the divider shut using long metal poles from outside the corridor, but nobody could safely enter while the animal was still moving around inside the passage. By the time they managed to secure the gate, Scott had already lost too much blood. A crew member called for help from the parking area. Responders arrived roughly 20 minutes later after initially driving to the wrong entrance behind the fairgrounds. Investigators later recovered damaged latch hardware, Scott's broken flashlight, and partial trailer camera footage showing the divider shifting seconds before the attack. The final report listed the cause of death as severe blood loss from injuries to the neck and upper body. Several crew members were later interviewed, and partial trailer camera footage from the transfer corridor was reviewed. The death was ultimately ruled an accidental mauling caused by enclosure failure during the evacuation. One failed divider and a few minutes of confusion were enough to turn a cramped transfer corridor into a deadly trap. It was June 14th, 2017, late at night at a wildlife park in the northwestern US. They were doing some maintenance near the grizzly bear area. Just routine work, nothing that should have been out of the ordinary. But it ended up turning into a really serious, fatal incident because of timing and coordination going wrong. The guy involved was Bren Taslow. He was 51. He worked in facilities, so his job was more on the infrastructure side, fixing mechanical systems, drainage lines, that kind of thing, and keeping access corridors in working order across the park. He wasn't a keeper or anything like that, and didn't deal with the animals directly. I usually think of guys like him as the ones you only notice when something stops working. His work still put him in those kinds of spaces pretty often, areas right next to where the animals were managed. And from what people said, he was usually pretty careful about it, especially anywhere near the carnivore sections. Earlier that evening, the adult male grizzly was relocated from the primary habitat into an indoor holding area for scheduled maintenance and inspection work, with coordination logs marking the habitat as operationally clear, and the animal expected to remain secured throughout the window. Bren entered the primary enclosure system during what was believed to be a safe maintenance period to clear a feed track blockage and inspect a drainage junction within a service corridor accessible only during animal relocation. This entry was based on a clearance status that had not yet been updated in the maintenance access system. While Bren was inside, the grizzly's handling plan was adjusted, and the animal was redirected earlier than scheduled through a secondary transfer route back into the habitat system. This created an unrecognized timing overlap as it re-entered infrastructure still in use for maintenance, placing both within the same corridor network. Bren first became aware of it when he heard movement behind him. When he turned, the grizzly was already in the same confined space after entering through the secondary route. There was little time to assess or react. He attempted to retreat toward the nearest access point, but the narrow corridor and fixed maintenance fixtures severely limited movement, reducing his withdrawal to short backward steps with no clear escape path. The bear came into the corridor after a brief orienting response and continued forward at close range. The encounter happened in tight quarters, leaving no time for a coordinated response. Bren suffered severe traumatic injuries and became rapidly incapacitated due to the force and speed of the impact, and I think when it happens that fast, there's just no real time left to process it properly. Because the corridor was isolated and the animal was still moving through the system, immediate intervention wasn't possible. Staff only became aware after inconsistencies appeared in relocation logs and system alerts were triggered. Response teams secured access points and entered under containment procedures, but Bren was already unresponsive and pronounced dead at the scene. A post-incident investigation determined the fatality resulted from a timing and coordination failure during a multi-stage animal relocation, where maintenance access was granted based on scheduled clearance rather than real-time confirmation of animal position. The primary failure point was identified as an unsynchronized clearance confirmation between relocation tracking and maintenance access authorization. Contributing factors included delayed inter-team communication and an unrecognized overlap between transfer routing and active corridor use.